I have the pleasure of welcoming Olivia Carville up to the stage. She is a reporter on Bloomberg's investigations team and a regular contributor to Business Week magazine. Previously, Carville was an award-winning journalist for national newspapers in both Canada and New Zealand. She moved to the US in 2017 to complete a master's degree in business reporting at Columbia University, where she was also awarded a Financial Journalist of the Year award. Since joining Bloomberg's New York office in 2018, she has received national recognition, including being named a finalist in the Livingston and Loeb Awards and winning the Women's Economic Roundtable Global Prize for Excellence in Business Journalism. Carville has also served on the board of the New York Financial Writers Association for the past 4 years. Please join me in welcoming her and our next panelist.
Well, thank you. That was a thorough bio. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be here with you guys today. I've attended a lot of these summits before, and I've always found the conversation really useful. I like to write about the intersection of online safety, particularly when it comes to children using social media and using technology today. And I'm very excited about this conversation with Nathaniel Lubin. I'm going to welcome him up to the stage now. So Nathaniel is incredibly qualified to have this conversation. I have a bio here that is ridiculously long, but I'm going to spare you all the details and just summarize it as quickly as possible. Nathaniel is a fellow on the Rebooting Social Media Institute. He's founder of the Better Internet Initiative, and he was the former director of the Office of Digital Strategy at the White House. So I think he's, uniquely qualified to talk to us today about the subject matter, which is looking ahead at responsible tech and what the best path forward is. So, in light of the recent conversations and the panel earlier, I think I'd like to start with you just explaining what exactly responsible tech is to you. I feel like I'd hazard a guess that everyone in this room might define it differently. And there is a bit of a buzzword element to responsible tech. So how do you view it? And what do you think responsible tech is?
Well, thanks for having me, to David and everyone, all the panelists, and a lot of people that I've admired from afar for a long time here, and good to see you. I think at the end of the day, it depends on what seat you're sitting in when you try to answer a question like that. We want to have a single answer around what we're aspiring for as a community. I think if you are a product manager or a leader of an organization, you might have a proactive answer around trying to do some sort of good. And we have a history of high-minded mission statements, a lot of organizations that haven't always been followed through in. I think it's a little different if you're a regulator or in government. We've had a lot of conversations today about government. I think the answer there is much more about a mitigation standard, right? We might have an aspirational goal of something much different than what the minimum standards a regulator might try to go after. And so when we talk about responsible tech, I think there should be some proactive definition about what doing good actually means if you're an organization trying to do that. I think that step is often lives in the land of mission statements, but not in terms of the product details of what an individual is trying to actually build.
So I did a bit of fangirling before this panel, and I was, researching you and the work you've done in the past. And one of the first bios that popped up, the first line said that you believe we already have the tools to fix what's broken in technology. So please share with us, what are these tools and why aren't we implementing them right now?
So the project that I'm working on right now at Harvard, which is sort of had a preview in the fall, and we're going to be rolling out later this year, and appreciate the chance to kind of give a little bit of a heads up on it now, is basically arguing that there are two different kinds of harms that happen as a kind of category statement, right? There's the acute harms that are more appropriate for moderation, and where you draw lines obviously is very difficult. But that there's a second set of categories of harms that have gotten a lot of attention, particularly around mental health and some of the other systematic effects of products and sort of architecture decisions that platforms make. And that we too often sort of conflate the responses to those two different kinds of problems. And so this project is trying to get into some of the more mechanism design methods that one might try to tackle something like a mental health effect if you could get participation from product designers. The thing about these products and the conversations I've had is that there are really smart people in these companies. Many of them are really well-intentioned, but their incentives are overwhelmingly oriented around growth and revenue driving metrics. And we have a lot of smart people who have come up with really good benchmarks and systems to assess things like mental health. And if you had those kinds of systems being assessed according to mental health metrics alongside growth ones, and actually had those feedback loops that are, the way that systems are being built, having some constraints tied to metrics like that, you wouldn't solve every problem by any means, but you'd have ways to try to have a more iterative and structured way to kind of crack down on some of the worst abuses. Now, how you do that is very difficult and involves a lot of details that are going to be out of scope for this conversation. But I think the starting point there is saying we have a lot of prior evidence from other fields and other areas that show us that these kinds of benchmarks and methods have worked in other places. And there's not a lot of reason to think that they couldn't at least contribute to sort of attacking some of these structural harms if the companies and platforms had the right reason to do it.
So essentially you think regulators or academics need to work with the product development teams inside these companies to kind of bake safety into the design. And historically, we know that access has been one of the big, the greatest difficulties we have. We don't understand the algorithms. We don't understand what's happening inside these companies. So what's the response been from industry?
It's been interesting. I think the folks who are in industry still, in big tech companies have been, have incentives that are against trying to take a lot of this seriously. But a lot of folks have unfortunately lost their jobs in recent months and have been much more engaging on these kinds of approaches consistently. And I think part of this is not just what does YouTube and Facebook do, but what is the next generation of companies doing? And if we can create some space for these kinds of approaches to be pursued, there's a lot of potential for demonstration of potential. I mean, the regulatory side of this is the other part of it, right? We had people earlier panels mentioned the importance of transparency, which I very much agree with. But I think we sometimes miss what we mean by transparency, right? We sort of skip over the general access to data with all the privacy implications of that. That there are plenty of problems for which that kind of access could help answer. But if you want to know, what are the effects on the kind of structural harms that we're talking about here, that probably doesn't exist in Mark Zuckerberg's email inbox, right? They don't have an incentive right now to try to answer those kinds of questions, at least not without, subpoenas. And so we need to figure out ways that are less confrontational for those kinds of metrics to be baked into the data transparency rules that we have, right? It's sort of the connecting the design side of the product development process to the transparency requirements.
So how do you begin that conversation to say, hey, let us have access to your product development team so we can try and fix this mental health crisis that's occurring right now?
I mean, I think it's all the folks in this room. It's the space for the academic community and other folks to kind of come up with specifics. We're going to propose some specific metrics and methods for this in this project coming out later this year. But the point of that is less about the specific metrics and more about the approach, the architecture kind of framing of this problem. And we certainly don't have a monopoly on good ideas here. It's going to be around trying to encourage many diverse perspectives to propose their own approaches to that. I think, when we have foreign governments, you mentioned earlier, the UK system has a harm reduction act that they just passed, and the DSA in the UK and the EU. A lot of the details about what they mean by harm mitigation there is going to be up to offices and future governments at the local level that have not actually put regulations in place yet, right? So there's a kind of huge open question, even where these places that have had laws passed, about what it actually means to do that kind of regulation. So I think there's a lot of opportunities right now to try to put specifics into those threads that are outside the scope of just the kind of 230 and free speech conversations that we've had. I mean, even this week with your arguments around 230, I think the space that seems to be going is one of not having a simple single answer for that, right? The justices seem to be taking this question seriously, but they're sort of struggling, and they've even said that around sort of understanding what it means to even have a harm here, right? And I think we need to kind of go back to a lot of the basics around building infrastructure that matches specific populations and the effects that are happening on them to conversations about what's appropriate, right? You can't have a conversation about responsibility without knowing who you're talking about and why. And that part needs to be kind of center in the initial design part of this, right? A lot of our friends from, kind of sociology and design worlds talk about the importance of centering communities in the initial design phases of products, and that's often not done, right? And that's not a thing that can be regulated directly, but if you had an incentive structure where the outcomes we're talking about were regulated, that would be a way to actually implement something as a designer to do that.
I think one of the things that was really interesting to me as I was reading about, this design framework and what it is that Nathaniel's trying to do is looking through a 2021 report that the United States Surgeon General released talking about the youth mental health crisis. This is called Protecting Youth Mental Health, and it's a pretty grim document to read. He talks about the rising cases of hopelessness, sadness, suicide rates among youth. And he actually comes up with recommendations to all stakeholders in society, the education system, parents, media, and social media companies. And one of the things he calls for of these companies is more transparency. He says that he wants these companies to let researchers study the impacts their products have on well-being, which is exactly what you're asking to do. This report was published in 2021, and correct me if I'm wrong, but not one company has allowed that access so far.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the current major media companies have a lot of incentives to do this. So I think we need to be thinking about, for regulation conversations, how this could be implemented, and then for smaller upcoming ones, how they might bake this in from the beginning where it doesn't have the same cost that they have. The prior panelist, was talking about the history of some of these questions and sort of other perspectives. A big part of this is, thinking about what has been the history of the public health infrastructure in this country and elsewhere, right? And, technology products we like to think of as very different. But I just read Silent Spring. I don't know if folks have read that. It's the sort of seminal 1962 book that kind of led to the environmental movement. And it sort of describes in excruciating detail a lot of the worst abuses that were happening. The literal weapons of war from World War II were deployed by industry. People were spraying it on their lawns. They didn't know any better, encouraged by industry. We're not facing that exact problem now. No one's saying that, Facebook is a weed killer. But I do think a lot of the infrastructure that was built around that matches a lot of the problems that we have. And right now we don't have the similar kinds of tools to understand cause and effect when someone is exposed, right? And that's sort of what we have to think about, right? If a product team in most of these companies, their own advancement, their own growth as an individual, as a team is benchmarked against randomized controlled trials where they have a holdout group that, if compared to that holdout group, there's not more people, consuming the product, right? They already have built a ton of infrastructure to do those kinds of tests. We just need to deploy them in ways that are a bit different from the ones that are going to happen without that kind of push.
So what would you be aiming to measure?
So the one we're thinking about first is sort of two metrics. One is a mental health benchmark. So a bunch of people smarter than me have come up with existing multi-question benchmarks and surveys to assess mental health. And so we're not trying to do anything other than sort through that and implement some version of those. And then the second thing we've been thinking about based on some prior work is looking at measures of social trust, right? We think that a lot of the misinformation, disinformation we have right now, it's not caused by a lack of trust, but it's highly correlated with that. And so if algorithmic decisions are leading to reductions in trust, or other architecture decisions by platform lead to reductions in trust, that's the kind of thing you might be able to measure using existing tools. Pew has been studying this for 60 or 70 years. Trust has been falling in this country, pretty much consistently that whole time. So there's a lot of existing benchmarks that we could tie into that kind of work.
One of the topics of conversation that came up in the last panel was talking about regulation or the lack of regulation and the need for regulation. It's hard to regulate a sector that we don't understand. And it's going to, I think a lot of it leads to this kind of chicken and egg dilemma where it's, you need regulation in order to gain access to some of this information that you're talking about. But without access, you can't regulate. Like, how are we going to, what's going to move the needle here?
I mean, I think that's a great question that I don't think I have the answer here. I wish I did. I think we need to start somewhere, right? So we need to find these issues that there's the most consensus. The prior panels mentioned the COSA Act, which almost passed. I think there's some interesting, illustrations of that, right? There was disagreement among organizations that often agree about whether that should have been passed on speech grounds. And I'm old enough to remember the net neutrality fights for a lot of these organizations were on the same side of issues. I was one of those people actually in government at the time. And I think there's illustrations of those kinds of coalitions and efforts that on the outside resulted in concrete movement and kind of moved government to take some of these issues more seriously. The earlier panel that Katie mentioned that, people coming from the left and the right maybe say that they, agree on the need for regulation, but maybe for very different reasons. I agree with that. But I think, if we started with a question like, there's a mental health crisis that most folks are in agreement. Let's start with understanding whether and how that's true among at-risk populations who are exposed to specific products, right? We just did that. I think we'd have a really strong incentive to, address other issues that are happening much more pervasively and much more broadly.
The question of regulating tech or being more responsible when it comes to these products raises a bit of a challenge when it comes to being overly paternalistic or these companies imposing policies that, go too far. And it kind of, I was chatting to a source the other day and they likened it to my boss, Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, trying to impose the soda tax and how much pushback that received. People hated that idea. I wasn't living in New York at the time, so I did look into what the soda tax was. And essentially he was saying, restaurants and bars can't give patrons a drink that's more than 16 ounces worth of soda, which seems really big in my mind. But people fought against that tooth and nail. They were like, let us have our massive drinks. I saw posters that were like, don't let bureaucrats tell you what you can and can't drink. So aren't we going to see the same pushback here? Won't people argue, why are these companies deciding what I should or shouldn't be allowed to see, or what is or isn't appropriate for me, or how my mental health may be impacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think any sort of restriction can lead to blowback of various kinds. I would not expect anything different here, but I think that is sort of why we need to really hit hard on the difference between minimum standards and aspirational goals. That's why I started there, right? You might say to a company, you have a lot of deference. You will have a lot of deference as long as, the socio-technical implementation of your product doesn't result in 14-year-olds wanting to hurt themselves, right? I think there's a lot of consensus on a question like that, which is very different from any number of algorithms or other sort of architecture choices that might live well ahead of that. And so we need to start with the cases where there's the most consensus rather than the least consensus. That probably means staying away from a lot of the political fights and sort of more partisan topics. Let's start with the easier ones. Not that they're easy at all, but they're easier, and try to start where we have that kind of a consensus. That's why, the kids' health part is one that is, I keep talking about, many others are keeping talking about, because I think that's one where no matter what your political ideology is, you're going to have a stronger incentive to jump in with something real.
This might be a bit off topic, but I've recently been looking into a story on mental health impacts of certain social media apps. And I've been reading the number of lawsuits that have recently been filed in the US against some of these big platforms, alleging that they pushed children into rabbit holes of harmful content that resulted in self-harm, eating disorders, in some cases suicide. And just yesterday, I was reading through a lawsuit where a product is essentially being accused of actually being responsible for a child's death. A 16-year-old boy took his own life by suicide, and the lawsuit itself is arguing that the platform is to blame. And when I was reading that same, United States Surgeon General report, it points out that when the media covers suicide, you need to be very careful to associate blame, that it's a multifaceted kind of issue. It's very complex, and you can never blame any one individual person or thing. And yet here we have lawsuits saying that these companies are responsible. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that falls more into that first category, right? So we've been talking about the argument of this project around structural harm assessments. I think, if someone is directly being induced to do something harmful, including self-harm, it's a much, stickier case around free speech. I think a lot of the benefits of the kind of approach we're talking about is that it has speech implications, but it's very different than regulating individual posts, regulating structural questions. That doesn't mitigate the need for moderation, right? You're still going to need moderation to go after any number of problems, CSAM or terrorist activity or whatever it may be. I mean, the court cases that are pending right now are about allegations around inducement of terrorism, very similar to what you're describing. I think in those cases, it's much more tied to, the specific allegations of a case, so it's kind of hard to know. I'm not arguing for repealing 230 kind of style approaches here. I think we still need to have a lot of protections on the speech part of this, but we need additional restrictions that can counter that.
I think when media, and I've certainly am guilty of this myself, when we tend to write about social media platforms, we do lean towards the moderation issue. It's it's low-hanging fruit. You can write easily about how difficult or challenging it is to moderate a platform. And there are always going to be cases where violent or violative content slips through the cracks. But this isn't really a moderation issue that we're talking about, are we? Even if these companies perfected moderation and came up with guidelines that everyone, not only in this room, but around the world agree with, and they did everything they could to moderate the content correctly, this is bigger than just moderation. It's not just the individualized pieces of content. We're talking about the design structure, the algorithm itself.
That's right. That's the discussions about what it means to have design principles. There's proactive ways to do that, but as a restrictive matter, as sort of the minimum viable standard for what is acceptable and harm, like we need something similar to this, Clean Air and Clean Water Act kind of idea, right? It says you can do a lot of what you want as long as there's not discrete harms to individual populations that are affected by that. That's the kind of idea of this. I mean, I think there's the idea of this is not to say that that's the only solution here, right? There's many problems and many different components of that. There's another project that I work on, which helps individuals with large content followings on these platforms to engage with pro-social material, right? That is a very different way to kind of engage with these kinds of issues. It's very different from regulatory strategy. It's very different from a moderation one, but it is a way of trying to broaden the aperture of pro-social positive material that is being consumed by a lot of people, right? And if you do that at scale, these kinds of trust metrics might be improved at the margins, right? And that might make it easier to counter some of the worst abuses. But again, it's not a one-time fix. It's kind of a longer term commitment to an approach to doing it.
When it comes to thinking about responsible tech, we can't be overly cautious, right? Like we can't be so cautious that we're preventing advancements in things like healthcare or self-driving cars or things that could potentially save lives in the future. A former colleague of mine wrote an op-ed on this topic recently, and there was something he said that really stood out to me that I just wanted to read to you today and get your thoughts on. He wrote, and this is Peter Coy, he's now at the New York Times. He wrote, "When things are changing as fast as they are, I don't feel comfortable with Silicon Valley bros telling us to mind our own business while they do their AI thing. It's okay to move fast and break things, but it's not okay to move fast and break the world." And this kind of ties back to that conversation that was held earlier. And, we have such little transparency into what's happening inside these companies, and yet they're moving at such a rapid clip that we almost can't catch up. It feels like academics, journalists, politicians, lawmakers, we're always going to be on the outside looking in, like trying to understand what's happening, but never really getting there.
I mean, I think the regulatory side of that, which again, I'm not a regulator, I've never done that, but I think the ambition needs to be to think more about processes in ways that are not our normal way of thinking about how to engage with problems rather than the specific details, right? I mean, work I've been doing has been thinking about social media specifically, but since we've been doing that ChatGPT came out, no one was thinking about that as a question of a vector for harm, 6 months ago, even, at least not in my community, it wasn't. And that's a case where moderation is not a vehicle to engage with that, right? There's not a moderation specific output that is outside of Kevin Roos asking weird questions. But I think if we think about systems, right, like, understanding what exposure to that iteratively over time by populations that are being tested for the product, right? Clearly, OpenAI has probably done a lot of testing of that product in the last 6 months or year or 2 years, and better transparency into that, and maybe some pushing on sort of what are the other questions that they weren't asking into that might be a way to get into some of those questions. And I think if you ask or maybe force companies to ask some of those questions, that would force them to slow down a little bit. It may not change their actual outcomes in terms of their decision-making incentives and goals, but even if they go slower to try to answer some other questions, that might have a positive effect.
With ChatGPT and these social, media products that were essentially pushed onto all of our phones in what's effectively like one massive psychological experiment with no control group covering an entire generation. I think, with a food product or a drug or an automobile, there is safety protocol and processes and systems already in place. Do you think consumer products like ChatGPT or like TikTok should have that same system?
I mean, I think for the EU has given us some, there's some issues with what they've done, but I think this is one where they have a pretty good answer, right? Which is when a product reaches a scale that it has a potential to have societal scale impact based on its number of users, there's a different logic for understanding what those societal scale effects are. I just gave the example of Silent Spring and chemicals, but the origin story of public health at all in sort of a modern sense was London in the 1850s, right? And they didn't have an understanding of what germs were. Germ theory was decades later, and yet they still there's a very complicated long history, but they were able to look at data about sort of where deaths were happening based on proximity to different neighborhoods. And that resulted in understanding that, cholera, the main problem at the time, one of them was tied to which water sources folks were drinking from, right? And that was without any of the mechanism understanding of why. In fact, what they thought it was happening was totally wrong. It was not what was happening, right? But that sort of systematic thinking about cause and effect led to a massive investment in hygiene and infrastructure and clean water, and that is sort of credited with the modern city being possible in a way that it wouldn't have been, right? So again, I think the case of a 16-year-old who hurts themselves is sort of the very human face of an illustration of the challenge here, and sort of maybe as a motivation for us to do more and invest in this more. But we need to be thinking about populations rather than individuals, right? And the individuals are not going to be, you can't outregulate the posts that an individual sees at scale in order to solve these problems, right? You have to think about the population effects.
So we've talked about, responsibility of corporations, responsibility of academics, in a sense, trying to do this work. We've talked about responsibility of regulators. What about parents? I feel like parents are navigating this uncharted territory and really have no idea what they should be doing. Like, all of these apps have different parental controls or guidelines or suggestions of how parents should better control what their kids can and can't see online. And every time I talk to a different social media app, the response is, if parents only knew how our product worked, they'd know all these safety tools and features we have to help them, control what their kids can and can't do online. But parents don't have time to study the intricacies of Snapchat or TikTok or Be Real, or they're not cool enough to keep up to date with where their kids are and, what social media app is the most popular one today. There's this new one called Be Real that apparently all the kids are using, and I haven't downloaded it, and I cover tech at Bloomberg. So, how can parents possibly figure all this out? And what advice would you have for their role and their responsibility in this?
I'm not a parent, so I would be loth to speak for parents. I think I would kind of flip it. I would say it's an unfair burden on parents to be responsible to answer that question. I think parents are going to make their own choices about what they do and do not want their kids to be exposed to. I think if many executives at big tech companies are afraid to let their kids use their products, that's an indication of something that we should take seriously. There's been reporting on that. But I think we need to give parents the tools to make decisions for themselves. But we need to, if a product is truly dangerous, right? That's sort of the threshold here, right? And I think actually part of the framing like this means that most products would pass these kinds of tests, right? We're not gonna, if you have a binding constraint, that doesn't mean that constraint binds always. It means it might bind occasionally. And the worst kinds of these abuses, would help a parent understand that they don't have to worry about that in the same way. As it is right now, I think the cautionary principle is probably a reasonable one in a lot of cases. And so, I don't have TikTok on my phone for maybe some different reasons as a former government official than some others in this room. But I think that's a reasonable fear. And the folks who are, I've been reading about some of the folks who brain science, doing analysis of the difference between 13-year-olds versus 15-year-olds versus 17-year-olds, right? And how a lot of those changes are, this is not my work, but others' work, sort of have kind of profound implications for, abilities to and responses to these kinds of products. So I think certainly. So
you mean that young people still have developing minds that don't have the ability of impulse control or rational decision making?
So if you don't have that that brain capacity yet, you probably will in a few years. We should probably be a bit more protective of those individuals to have some additional support and protections without it.
The last story I wrote was pretty odd. It was looking at when parents are the problem. I followed a young creator down in Florida who has about 7 million followers on TikTok, and her parents actually encourage her to lean into shock value content. So to post highly inappropriate, highly sexualized videos in order to gain more followers, get more fame, and ultimately make more money. And I spent a week with this young creator and her family trying to understand the dynamics and what was going on here. And I actually asked the mum on record, what are you concerned about the fact that at the age of 10, your daughter had 500,000 followers watching her do belly dancing clips, or if at the age of 15, she has 7 million followers, a significant proportion of those followers are adult men, and she's a 15-year-old girl. And the mum's response was quite shocking. She said, no, we love the fame. We love the attention. I always knew I was going to be famous, and we know how to game this algorithm. We post shock value content in order to make her more famous. And, we're really good at it. And that kind of exposed this other interesting element of, the dilemma facing society, which is what happens when you've got parental exploitation going on. And you see a lot of these kind of mummy run accounts on TikTok and other versions of social media where they post the daily life of their child, nappy changes, tantrums, everything. And these kids don't have the ability to say, hey, I don't want my entire life on the internet, or me having my nappy changed, being sent out to millions of people. How do you think these children from, the age of kids who are exposed to this stuff online through their parents, all the way up to the cases that we've been talking about and the young developing minds and teenagers not really understanding it? What are our kids going to think 10, 20 years when they're the ones up here talking and saying, wait, what were you guys doing? Why did you allow this to happen?
I think there's a strong history of thinking things used to be better in every structure that you're in, and thinking the next generation is screwing it up and doesn't know what they're investing in. So I'm sure there'll be some version of that. But I think the tension you're pointing at, I think, is an interesting one in that that's a very different question than a regulatory question or even a product one, which is we need to have a culture around understanding how to use these products and how to think about it. There's another colleague at the program I'm in at Harvard who's working on a procedure, a sort of ritual, he calls it, to give children their first phone. It's very early in that project. But I think that's an interesting idea, right? Because it's not one that is a mandate on companies or on regulations, but it's sort of trying to create a different way of engaging with technology that we haven't had experience with. And those norms, the kind of classic rule, laws and norms need to interact together in ways that are positive and productive. And we're not going to solve these on either side alone. We have to have both in ways that are productive.
Right. So my last question for you, Nathaniel, is I'm wondering if you can share with the group any secrets you learned during your time as Director of Digital Strategy in the White House. Anything that maybe is hopeful that we can be excited about for the future, because this conversation has been quite dark so far.
I should give me some heads up on that. I had the joy of working with the former president. So I would say he was much more hip to what was going on online than folks gave him credit for, and sort of was the same person behind the scenes that he was in front of cameras as well. We had the chance to get him in an interview with David Simon, the former creator of The Wire, and sort of nerding out around sort of the way media and various other threads online sort of interact with culture and community. So I think like those kinds of moments are ones that show that the humanities side of this, even in these jobs where you're the president or speaking for a lot of people, influencing a lot of people, that humanity still has to kind of be the core of it, and the technology parts of that were very tied to. I think the other thing is, I mentioned the net neutrality conversations earlier, the kind of broader community that was outside in the world, and the ways that a lot of really important advocates, made a lot of attention to that, really did impact the policy. And I think it's easy to lose that faith that there is an ability for, lots of people to have a contribution like that. And that I always saw that up close, that was really true.
Well, best of luck for your research. I think we'll all be interested to see how it goes. And thank you so much for closing the session today.